Music swelled, suffocating the ballroom in forced elegance. She didn't belong here among stolen diamonds and tailored lies. Neither did he. Gerardo Hughes stood by the champagne tower, a king pretending to be a guest. He was untouchable. Until she slipped her arm through his, her perfume a mix of vanilla and sheer desperation, and pressed her lips to his ear. "Dance as my husband. There's a red dot on your forehead." Part 1. The moving target. Gerardo didn't flinch. Men in his position who flinched were usually buried in closed caskets. His body went rigid for a fraction of a second, the heavy fabric of his tuxedo tightening across his shoulders, before training took over. He didn't look for the sniper. Looking meant pausing. Pausing meant dying. Instead, he looked down at the woman attached to his arm. Sienna Mason offered him a smile so bright and entirely devoid of warmth it belonged on a billboard. Her grip on his bicep was a vice. She wore a dark emerald gown that caught the low light of the chandeliers, but her knuckles were stark white. "Step," she whispered, her teeth barely parting. Gerardo moved. He placed a broad, heavy hand on her waist, pulling her flush against him, with enough force to knock the breath from her lungs. If they were going to play this game, he was leading. He stepped backward, dragging her into the flow of couples waltzing across the marble floor. "Who?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against her chest. "South Gallery. Second tier. Behind the velvet drapes." Sienna replied, keeping her gaze fixed lovingly on his jawline. "Keep your head moving, Gerardo. He's using a laser sight, which means he's arrogant, but he's got a clear lane from the balcony." Gerardo spun her. The movement was sharp, tearing them across 3 feet of open floor. As they turned, he caught a flicker of crimson light, dancing across the crystal of a passing waiter's tray. She wasn't lying. The dot was frantically searching for a resting place, trying to track his erratic movements through the crowd. "You called me your husband," Gerardo muttered, dipping her slightly as the orchestra swelled. He could feel the slight tremor in her spine. She was terrified, but she was hiding it well. "It got your attention," she said, pulling herself back upright. "And if anyone asks later, we eloped in Vegas last month. It gives me a reason to be dragging you across a dance floor like a maniac. It gives me a reason to shoot you myself when this is over." "Get in line," Sienna shot back. Gerardo analyzed the room. The exits were choked with oblivious socialites, politicians, and businessmen. The heavy mahogany doors leading to the kitchen corridors were 30 yards away. Too far to walk without the sniper anticipating their path. They had to keep moving in unpredictable arcs. He tightened his grip on her waist, his thumb pressing into the soft fabric of her dress, feeling the rigid line of tension in her muscles. She wasn't one of his people. He knew every face in his organization, every politician on his payroll, and every rival who wanted him dead. Sienna was a ghost, yet she knew his name. She knew there was a shooter, and she had stepped into the crosshairs to warn him. "Why didn't you just let him take the shot?" Gerardo asked. He spun her again, a complex twirl that forced the red dot to sweep harmlessly across a marble pillar. "Because if you die tonight, Virgil Woods takes over the docks by morning," Sienna said. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. "And if Virgil takes the docks, I'm dead by tomorrow afternoon. I need you breathing." Gerardo's eyes hardened. Virgil Woods. It always came back to Virgil. "Kitchen doors." Gerardo said, his tone shifting from mild curiosity to flat operational command. 3 o'clock. When the cello hits the low note, I'm going to throw you to the left. Hit the floor and crawl behind the ice sculpture. Don't stop moving." "I'm not leaving you," she snapped, missing a step. "You're going to do exactly what I tell you, or we both bleed out on this imported marble." Gerardo didn't wait for her argument. He mapped the trajectory. The sniper was getting impatient. The red dot was lagging behind Gerardo's movements, adjusting, trying to predict where his skull would be in the next half-second. The orchestra ground down into a heavy, mournful bridge. The cellos groaned. Gerardo shoved her. He didn't do it gently. He planted his hand on her sternum and pushed with enough force to send her sprawling backward into a cluster of horrified guests. At the exact same moment, Gerardo dropped his weight, twisting his torso. The loud synthetic pop of a suppressed rifle cracked through the music. A crystal chandelier above them exploded. Glass rained down in a deafening crash, tearing through the silk dresses and tailored suits of the crowd. Screams erupted. The delicate illusion of the gala shattered in an instant, replaced by raw animal panic. People trampled each other, scrambling for the exits. Gerardo hit the floor, rolling over the slick marble. He drew the compact Glock 43 from his ankle holster in a singular fluid motion. He didn't fire. Shooting blindly into a panicked crowd was amateur work. He scrambled behind the base of an ice sculpture shaped like a swan, the frozen water already beginning to crack from a stray bullet. He looked for the emerald dress. Sienna was 10 feet away, crawling through the spilled champagne and broken glass. Her knee was bleeding, a jagged cut tearing through the expensive fabric, but she wasn't stopping. She was dragging herself toward the heavy kitchen doors, exactly as he had told her. Gerardo respected survival instincts. He pushed off the floor, keeping his profile low, and sprinted after her. Part 2. The getaway. The kitchen was a war zone of abandoned pots and screaming staff. Gerardo grabbed Sienna by the back of her dress, hauling her to her feet without slowing down. "Run!" he barked. They tore through the stainless steel labyrinth. The smell of roasting garlic and burnt butter hung heavy in the air, a bizarre contrast to the adrenaline pumping through their veins. Gerardo kept his body angled between her and the doors they had just breached. If the shooter had a ground team, they would be coming through those doors in seconds. He kicked open the rear service exit. The damp, humid air of the city hit them like a physical wall. The alley was dark, smelling of rotting produce and wet asphalt. A black, armored SUV sat idling 20 yards away. The driver, Tommy, already had his door open, a submachine gun resting on the roof, scanning the fire escapes. "Boss!" Tommy yelled, his voice tight. "Get in." Gerardo shoved Sienna toward the rear passenger door. A bullet pinged off the brick wall inches from Gerardo's head, showering him in red dust. The sniper had relocated fast. Too fast. Gerardo fired 3 rounds blindly toward the rooftop across the street, suppressing the shooter just long enough for Sienna to dive into the back seat of the SUV. Gerardo threw himself in after her, slamming the heavy armored door shut just as another round struck the reinforced glass. The window spiderwebbed but held. "Drive now," Gerardo ordered. Tommy slammed the transmission into gear. The heavy tires spun against the wet pavement, screeching in protest before catching traction. The SUV launched forward, tearing out of the alley and merging violently into the city traffic. Inside the cabin, the silence was suffocating, broken only by the roar of the engine and the harsh, ragged breathing of the 2 passengers in the back. Gerardo didn't relax. He kept his gun drawn, his eyes scanning the mirrors, watching for a tail. When he was finally satisfied that they were clear of the immediate perimeter, he turned his attention to the woman beside him. Sienna was pressed against the far door, her knees pulled tight together. She was trembling now, the adrenaline crash hitting her hard. She reached down, pressing a hand over the gash on her knee. Blood seeped through her fingers, staining the emerald silk a dark, muddy brown. Gerardo reached into his jacket and tossed a pristine white handkerchief onto her lap. "Hold pressure." He set his voice flat. Sienna took the cloth, her hands shaking so badly she could barely fold it. She pressed it against her skin, letting out a sharp hiss of pain. She didn't look at him. She stared straight ahead at the back of Tommy's headrest. "You lied," Gerardo said. Sienna blinked, finally turning her head. Her eyes were sharp, defiant, despite the trembling in her hands. Excuse me. You said Virgil Wood sent a shooter. Virgil doesn't use laser sights. He thinks they're sloppy. He uses old-school optics. Iron sights if he's close enough. That wasn't Virgil's man on the balcony. Sienna swallowed hard. She looked down at the blood soaking through the handkerchief. It doesn't matter who pulled the trigger. Virgil put out the contract. It was an open bid. Half the freelance hitters in the city were probably fighting for a spot in that gallery. Gerardo studied her. She was a civilian. Or at least she moved like one. She lacked the hardened, dead-eyed stare of a professional criminal, but she possessed a desperate, feral intelligence. "Who are you?" Gerardo demanded. "And don't give me a fake name. I can have Tommy run your face through facial recognition before we cross the bridge." "Sienna Mason," she said. Her voice cracked, and she hated herself for it. She cleared her throat and tried again. "Sienna Mason. I was Virgil's forensic accountant." Gerardo let out a short, humorless laugh. It was a harsh sound that filled the heavy air of the SUV. Up until 48 hours ago, I found something, a discrepancy in the shipping ledgers for the South Port. Virgil isn't just moving narcotics anymore. He's moving people, trafficking. It wasn't what I signed up for. You work for the Mafia, sweetheart," Gerardo said, leaning back against the leather seat, the gun resting casually on his thigh. "You don't get to moralize." "I didn't care about the drugs." Sienna shot back her anger, finally cutting through her fear. "I didn't care about the gambling or the extortion, but I draw the line at selling kids in shipping containers. I downloaded the ledgers, the encrypted files. I have them on a flash drive." Gerardo stopped smiling. The temperature in the car seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Virgil found out," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He sent men to my apartment. I barely got out. I've been running for 2 days. I knew he was going to make a play for you tonight at the gala. He needs you out of the way so he can secure the northern docks to move the containers." "So you decided to play hero." "I decided to play survival." Sienna corrected him, her eyes locking onto his. "If you die, Virgil controls the whole port. If Virgil controls the port, he has the resources to hunt me down no matter where I run. I need him broken. And you're the only one with enough firepower to break him." Gerardo stared at her. She was bargaining for her life with chips she barely understood. It was pathetic. It was reckless. It was also exactly what he needed. "Tommy," Gerardo called out to the front. "Cancel the sweep at the estate. Take us to the glass house." Tommy glanced in the rearview mirror, his brow furrowed. "The unfinished tower, boss. It's completely off the grid." "Exactly," Gerardo said. He looked back at Sienna, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You wanted a husband, Miss Mason. I hope you're ready for the honeymoon." Part 3. The glass house. The tower was a skeletal spire of concrete and steel, reaching 60 stories into the smog-choked night sky. It was one of Gerardo's legitimate development projects, stalled by zoning permits he had intentionally sabotaged just to keep the building empty. It was cold, raw, and completely invisible to anyone who didn't know how to navigate the freight elevators. The wind howled through the open framework of the 59th floor. Temporary floodlights cast harsh, elongated shadows against the bare concrete floors. Gerardo threw his ruined tuxedo jacket onto a stack of drywall. He unholstered his weapon, checked the chamber out of habit, and set it on a makeshift plywood table. He rolled up the sleeves of his white dress shirt, revealing forearms corded with muscle and faded ink. Sienna stood near the center of the room, her arms wrapped around herself against the biting wind. The emerald dress, beautiful an hour ago, now looked like a costume from a tragic play. She shivered violently, her teeth chattering. Gerardo watched her for a moment. He didn't feel pity. Pity was a useless emotion that got men killed. But she was a strategic asset now, and assets needed to be maintained. He walked over to a heavy canvas duffel bag sitting in the corner, pulled out a thick grey wool blanket and tossed it to her. It hit her in the chest. She fumbled with it, wrapping it tightly around her bare shoulders. "Thank you," she muttered. Gerardo didn't reply. He pulled a portable medical kit from the bag and walked over to her. He pointed to a plastic crate. "Sit." Sienna hesitated, then complied. Gerardo knelt in front of her. He didn't ask for permission. He grasped her ankle, his large hand wrapping completely around the delicate bone, and lifted her injured leg. He pulled back the torn silk of her dress to expose the gash on her knee. It was deep. It needed stitches, but he didn't have the time or the patience for delicate work tonight. He ripped open a packet of antiseptic wipes. "This is going to burn," he said. Before she could brace herself, he pressed the wipe into the wound. Sienna gasped, her body jerking backward, but Gerardo's grip on her ankle was like iron. He didn't let her pull away. He cleaned the blood and grit out of the cut with clinical detached efficiency. "Why didn't you just go to the police?" Gerardo asked, his eyes focused on his work. Sienna let out a breathy, cynical laugh. "The police half the precinct is on Virgil's payroll. The other half is on yours. Going to the cops is just asking for a bullet with a state-sponsored stamp on it." Gerardo squeezed a line of surgical glue over the cut, pinching the skin together. "You're not wrong." "I know I'm not wrong," Sienna said, watching the top of his head. His dark hair was disheveled, the expensive styling ruined by sweat and wind. Up close, he didn't look like the untouchable Mafia king she had seen in the magazines. He looked tired. He looked like a man who carried a mountain on his back and didn't know how to put it down. "You said you have ledgers?" Gerardo said, securing a bandage over her knee and letting her leg drop gently back to the floor. He stood up, towering over her. "Where are they?" "Safe," Sienna said, meeting his gaze. "That's not a location. It's insurance," she countered. "I give you the ledgers, now you have no reason to keep me alive. I'm a liability. I've seen your face. I've been in your car. I know about this safe house. The moment I hand over the drive, you'll put a bullet in the back of my head and throw me off this balcony." Gerardo tilted his head, genuinely amused. "You have a very low opinion of me, Miss Mason. I have an accurate opinion of you, Mr. Hughes. You don't build an empire by being sentimental. You kill threats. Right now, I'm useful. I intend to stay useful." Gerardo walked over to the edge of the floor. There were no windows yet, just a sheer drop down to the glittering streetlights below. He pulled a silver case from his pocket, extracted a cigarette, and lit it. The flare of the lighter illuminated the sharp planes of his face. He blew a stream of smoke out into the howling wind. "Here is how this works," Gerardo said, turning his back to the city. "You're going to stay here. I have men stationed at the base of the tower and on the freight elevator. You can't leave. Tomorrow I'm going to start hitting Virgil's operations. Hard. I'm going to burn his shipments, sink his boats, and put his lieutenants in the ground. When he's bleeding, when he's desperate, I'll use your ledgers to finish him with the feds." Sienna gripped the edges of the wool blanket. "And what happens to me when it's over?" Gerardo took another drag of his cigarette. He looked at her. Really looked at her. She was bruised, bleeding, and shivering in an abandoned building, but she hadn't broken. She had looked a sniper in the eye and dragged a Mafia boss across a dance floor to save her own life. There was a dark, twisted kind of beauty in that desperation. "When it's over," Gerardo said slowly, the smoke curling around his words, "we get an annulment." Sienna let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. It wasn't a promise of safety, but it was a promise of time. And right now, time was the only currency she had left. "Fine," she said. She pulled the blanket tighter. "But if we're going to be married for the next week, you're buying the coffee tomorrow." Gerardo's mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. He dropped the cigarette onto the concrete floor and crushed it beneath the heel of his Italian leather shoe. "Deal." The violence that erupted over the next 48 hours wasn't pretty. It wasn't the cinematic, clean warfare of old mob movies. It was brutal, calculated, and ugly. Gerardo kept his word. He hit Virgil Woods's infrastructure with a precision that bordered on surgical. Sienna remained trapped in the glass house. Tommy brought her food, fresh clothes, and a burner phone, with only one contact programmed into it. On the third night, Gerardo returned. He stepped off the freight elevator, his white shirt splattered with dark, drying blood that wasn't his own. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his eyes bruised and heavy. Sienna was sitting on a folding chair near a space heater Tommy had brought up. She stood when she saw him, her eyes dropping immediately to the blood. "Are you hurt?" she asked. It was an instinctive question, a slip of humanity she hadn't intended to show. Gerardo looked down at his shirt as if noticing it for the first time. No. He walked over to the plywood table and unstrapped a heavy tactical vest, letting it hit the wood with a dull thud. Virgil lost the northern docks. His men folded. They're abandoning ship faster than rats. "So it's over?" Sienna asked, stepping closer. "Not yet," Gerardo said. He turned to look at her. The adrenaline of the raid was still burning in his veins, making his eyes hyper-focused, predatory. "He's cornered. Cornered animals don't just roll over. They bite. He knows someone leaked the roots. It won't take him long to figure out it was you. He already knew I took the ledgers. Taking them is one thing. Weaponizing them is another. He knows you're with me now." Gerardo stepped into her space. He was too close. The smell of gunpowder copper and cheap coffee radiated off him. The rumor on the street is that Gerardo Hughes took a new bride at the gala, a woman in an emerald dress. Virgil is hunting a ghost, but he's hunting her in my territory. Sienna held her ground, refusing to step back. "You used the rumor. You leaked it yourself, didn't you, to draw him out?" "I used every weapon I had," Gerardo said softly. His voice was a low rasp. "You included." "I'm not a weapon, Gerardo. I'm a target." "Not anymore." Gerardo lifted his hand. For a second, Sienna thought he was going to strike her. Her breath hitched, but his rough, calloused fingers merely brushed against her jawline, pushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was shockingly gentle, a jarring contrast to the violence radiating from his body. "As long as you wear my name, even as a lie, you are untouchable," Gerardo whispered. "Understand?" Sienna stared up at him. She could see the darkness in him, the cold, calculating void that allowed him to run an empire of blood. But in that void there was a strange, terrifying gravity pulling her in. She was supposed to be surviving him. Instead, she was starting to rely on him. "I understand," she said, her voice barely carrying over the wind. Gerardo held her gaze for a long moment, his thumb resting against her pulse point. It was beating frantically against his skin. He didn't pull away. He just stood there, letting the silence stretch between them, a fragile truce, built on a foundation of lies and high-caliber ammunition. This was the devil she had chosen to dance with, and the music was far from over. Part 4, The Ledger. Morning broke over the city in streaks of bruised purple and smoggy grey. The wind had died down, leaving the skeletal 59th floor of the glass house wrapped in a damp, suffocating chill. Gerardo hadn't slept. He sat on a plastic crate by the edge of the drop, disassembling and cleaning his Glock with a rhythmic mechanical precision. The slide racked back with a sharp, metallic snap. Sienna woke to the sound. Her neck ached from sleeping in the folding chair, the heavy wool blanket twisted around her legs. She rubbed the grit from her eyes and watched him for a long moment. He was a machine running on caffeine and malice. "Did Tommy bring a laptop?" she asked, her voice raspy from sleep. Gerardo didn't look up. He wiped down the barrel of the gun with an oiled rag. "There's a briefcase by the space heater. It's encrypted, air-gapped. Don't try to connect to the outside world or the firewall will fry the hard drive. Sienna tossed the blanket aside and walked over to the black Pelican case. She snapped the latches open, pulling out a heavy military-grade laptop. She set it on the plywood table and booted it up. I don't need the internet. I just need to plug in my drive. She reached into her bra, fishing out the tiny metal USB drive she had kept pressed against her skin for 3 days. It was warm. She slotted it into the side of the machine. Rows of numbers shell corporations and encrypted transaction logs flooded the screen. You hit his docks! Sienna said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. That disrupts his physical supply chain. But Virgil doesn't care about boats. He cares about liquidity. He has a payroll of 200 men. Mercenaries hitters, corrupt dock workers. If they don't get paid by Friday, they walk. Gerardo slid the magazine back into the grip of his pistol. He stood walking over to stand behind her. His presence was a heavy, solid weight at her back. I know how Virgil structures his cash flow, Gerardo said, leaning over her shoulder to look at the screen. He smelled of gun oil and stale tobacco. He keeps his operational funds in 3 separate Cayman accounts routed through dummy corporations in Delaware. That was true 6 months ago. Sienna corrected him. But he got paranoid when the feds audited his shipping fronts in Miami. He moved the bulk of his liquid assets. He thought offshore was too predictable. Gerardo frowned, his eyes narrowing at the spreadsheet she brought up. Where is it? Cyprus YF, Sienna said. She highlighted a block of transactions. He bought a defunct textile company. It's a shell. He's been funneling the profits from the trafficking ring there for the last 90 days. It's sitting in a holding account waiting to be washed through real estate. How much? 42 million. Gerardo was silent. 42 million wasn't just operational capital, it was a war chest. With that kind of money, Virgil could buy a small army to level half the city, let alone one unfinished skyscraper. Can you access it? Gerardo asked. I am an accountant, not a hacker. Sienna muttered, chewing on her lower lip. I have the routing numbers and the account architecture. But I need to be on a secure network to spoof his credentials and initiate a wire transfer. This air-gapped brick won't do it. We need an actual server. And we need to do it before he realizes I took this specific ledger. The heavy metal doors of the freight elevator groaned open, cutting the conversation short. Tommy stepped out. His usual stoic demeanor was gone. His suit jacket was torn, and a smear of soot darkened the left side of his face. He moved with a slight limp, carrying a heavy canvas bag. Tommy. Gerardo said, his tone instantly shifting back to the cold commander. Report. He hit the Cobalt Lounge boss. Tommy said, dropping the bag on the floor. It clanked heavily. Ammunition. Car bomb in the alley. Blew out the kitchen and the back offices. 3 of our guys are dead. 2 in the hospital. Gerardo's jaw tightened. The Cobalt was one of his premier legitimate fronts. It was a message. Virgil was bleeding, and he was thrashing wildly. We also caught chatter on the police scanners. Tommy continued, looking nervously at Sienna. Virgil put a bounty on the girl. $5 million, alive or dead. He blasted her face to every freelancer from here to Boston. Sienna stopped typing. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. $5 million. For that kind of money, her own neighbors would shoot her in the back. She wasn't just a target anymore, she was a lottery ticket. Gerardo didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy tactical vest from the table and threw it over his shoulders, securing the Velcro straps with sharp, violent tugs. Pack up the laptop, Gerardo ordered Sienna. Where are we going? She asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. The glasshouse is a dead end. Gerardo said, checking his spare magazines. We're sitting ducks up here. If Virgil is burning my clubs, it means he's stopped playing defense. We need to go on the offensive. You said you need a server to drain his Cyprus account. Yes. Pack it up. We're going to the underground. Part 5, the hemorrhage. The underground wasn't a basement. It was a fortified server farm buried beneath a defunct subway station that Gerardo had bought from the city 5 years ago. The air down here was thick with the hum of industrial cooling fans and the sterile smell of ozone. Sienna sat at a steel desk in a glass-walled command room. Her fingers flew across a mechanical keyboard, the heavy clack-clack-clack echoing in the quiet space. 2 of Gerardo's heavily armed guards stood outside the glass door, their rifles resting across their chests. Gerardo paced behind her like a caged predator. He was on a headset coordinating the retaliation for the Cobalt Lounge. His voice was a low, steady murmur of violence. "Burn the warehouse on 4th. Leave no one inside. Send a message to the unions. Anyone unloading Virgil's freight gets their kneecaps shattered. No exceptions." He ripped the headset off and threw it onto the desk next to Sienna. "Status. I'm in the Cyprus banking portal," Sienna said, not looking away from the monitors. Sweat beaded at her temples. "Virgil's security protocols are a joke, but the banks aren't. I'm routing the spoofed IP through 3 different countries to mask our location." "How long?" "5 minutes," she said. "But the second I initiate the transfer, it's going to trigger an automated alert to his phone. He's going to know he's being robbed. He'll have exactly 3 minutes to call the bank and freeze the assets before the wire clears into your dummy accounts." Gerardo leaned over her, his hands planted on the steel desk. "We just need to make sure he's too busy to answer his phone." He picked up a sleek black radio from the console. "Tommy, status on the convoy." Tommy's voice crackled through the speaker. "We have a visual on Virgil. He's moving from his safe house in the Heights. 3 armored SUVs, heading south on the interstate." "Hit them," Gerardo ordered. "Keep him pinned down. Don't let him breathe and don't let him look at his phone." "Copy that, boss." Sienna swallowed hard. She was a woman who dealt in spreadsheets, tax codes, and fiscal projections. Now she was orchestrating a $40 million heist while a literal gunfight was triggered on her command. The surrealness of it threatened to choke her, but she forced the panic down. Survival required focus. "Initiating the transfer now," she said. She hit the enter key. A progress bar appeared on the screen, a slow, agonizing crawl of green pixels. 10%. 20%. "Tommy, talk to me!" Gerardo barked into the radio. Gunfire erupted through the speaker, a deafening staccato of automatic weapons. Tires screeched. "We boxed him in on the overpass," Tommy yelled over the noise. "Heavy resistance. They've got military-grade hardware. 40%. 50%. Sienna stared at the bar. It was moving too slowly. The bank was verifying the multi-stage routing numbers. "He's trying to push through our blockade," Tommy shouted. The sound of metal crunching against metal echoed through the radio. "Boss, we can't hold him here forever. Hold the line, Tommy. Give me 2 minutes." Gerardo said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. He looked down at Sienna. "Can you speed it up? It's a bank, Gerardo, not a download." She snapped the stress, finally breaking her polite veneer. "It moves at the speed of bureaucracy. 70%? 80%? Suddenly the progress bar halted. A flashing red warning dialog box popped up on the screen. "Authorization required. 2-factor authentication sent to primary device." Sienna's blood ran cold. "Damn it!" "What is it?" Gerardo demanded. "The bank flagged the transfer size. They sent a confirmation code to Virgil's phone. If he doesn't enter the code in 60 seconds, the transfer cancels, and the account locks down." Gerardo snatched the radio. "Tommy Virgil's phone. He's going to check his phone. You have to stop him." "We're taking heavy fire, boss. I can't even see his vehicle through the smoke." Sienna stared at the countdown timer on the screen. 50 seconds. 45. They were going to lose the money. Virgil was going to keep his war chest, and she was going to have a $5 million bounty on her head for the rest of her very short life. She slammed her fist on the desk. "Think," she muttered to herself. "Think." She pulled up the network architecture she had mapped out earlier. The holding account wasn't a direct bank account. It was a textile shell company. Shell companies had administrative backdoors for their primary shareholders. 30 seconds. "What are you doing?" Gerardo asked, watching her fingers blur across the keyboard. "I can't bypass the bank, but I can bypass the shell company." Sienna said, her eyes manic. "I'm changing the primary device registered to the account." 20 seconds. She typed lines of code into a terminal window, exploiting a vulnerability in the company's outdated internal directory. 10 seconds. "I need your phone," she yelled, holding out her hand. Gerardo didn't ask questions. He pulled his encrypted smartphone from his pocket and slapped it into her palm. Sienna jammed the USB charging cable from the computer into the bottom of his phone. She ran a quick command script to force the network to recognize Gerardo's device as the primary administrator. 5 seconds. A sharp chime echoed in the quiet room. Gerardo's phone vibrated on the desk. A text message flashed on the screen: Cyprus National Bank auth code 893402. Sienna hammered the numbers into the dialog box on the monitor and slammed the enter key. The red warning vanished. The green progress bar jumped from 80% to 100%. Transfer complete. Sienna collapsed back into her chair, her lungs burning as she gasped for air. Her hands were shaking so violently she had to clench them into fists to hide it. Gerardo stared at the screen. $42 million. Gone from Virgil's grasp. Moved securely into Gerardo's untraceable offshore accounts. He keyed the radio. "Tommy, pull back. Disengage." The gunfire on the other end of the line slowly died down, replaced by the sound of sirens in the distance. "Copy that. We're pulling out." Gerardo set the radio down. He looked at the woman sitting in the steel chair. She was exhausted, terrified, and out of her depth. But she had just broken the back of his greatest rival, using nothing but a keyboard and sheer stubborn willpower. "You robbed him," Gerardo said quietly. Sienna looked up at him, a weak, cynical smile touching the corner of her mouth. "You're the Mafia boss. I just balance the checkbooks." Gerardo reached out his hand, resting on the back of a chair. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. The cold, impenetrable wall he usually kept between himself and the world had cracked just a fraction. "Remind me." Gerardo murmured, his voice a low vibration that made her stomach tighten. "Never to let you do our taxes." Part 6. The Margin of Error. The adrenaline crash hit Sienna like a physical blow. The moment the screen confirmed the transfer, the sheer impossible weight of what she had done settled onto her chest. She had stolen $42 million from a man who regularly dissolved his problems in industrial lie. She pushed away from the steel desk, the wheels of her chair squeaking against the concrete floor. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, suddenly nauseous. The sterile air-conditioned chill of the server room seeped into her bones, making her shiver beneath the oversized wool blanket. Gerardo watched her. He didn't offer platitudes or a comforting hand. He understood the crash. He lived in it. Instead, he walked over to a mini-fridge in the corner of the room, pulled out a bottle of water and tossed it to her. She caught it clumsily. "Drink," he said, pulling up a secondary chair and sitting backward on it, resting his arms over the backrest. Sienna unscrewed the cap and drank. The cold water helped ground her. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice quiet in the hum of the cooling fans. "Now Virgil bleeds out," Gerardo replied. His voice was flat, devoid of the triumph she expected. "You severed his main artery. The men on his payroll won't stick around when the Friday checks bounce. The mercenaries will vanish. His lieutenants will start fighting over the scraps. By tomorrow night he won't have an empire. He'll just be a man in a very large, very empty house. But he still has the bounty on me." Gerardo nodded slowly. $5 million is enough to make anyone stupid. It means we stay underground until I locate him and put a bullet in his chest myself. We don't move until I can guarantee the threat is neutralized." Sienna looked down at the plastic water bottle. The label was peeling at the edges. "I'm ruining your week." It was a weak attempt at a joke, a defense mechanism to keep the terror at bay. Gerardo didn't laugh, but the hard lines around his mouth softened. "I've had worse weeks," he said. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his crossed arms. The harsh fluorescent lights cast deep shadows over the planes of his face. He looked stripped down, the untouchable Mafia boss, replaced by a tired man fighting a war on 3 fronts. "You held your own today, Sienna. Most seasoned operators would have frozen when that bank alert popped up. You didn't. I was terrified. Fear keeps you sharp. Panic kills you. You didn't panic." He reached out. This time there was no hesitation. His rough, calloused fingers wrapped around her wrist, gently pulling her hand away from her stomach. He turned her hand over his thumb, tracing the faint purple bruising on her knuckles from where she had hit the marble floor at the gala. The touch was electric. It shouldn't have been. He was dangerous, a violent man steeped in blood and extortion. But right now his grip was the only solid thing in a world spinning rapidly, out of control. "You said we get an annulment when this is over." Sienna murmured, her eyes fixed on his hand holding hers. "I did." "Does the offer still stand if I'm the one bringing the dowry?" She gestured weakly toward the computer screen, showing the empty Cyprus account. Gerardo's chest rumbled with a low, genuine chuckle. It was a rare, startling sound that warmed the freezing room. "You stole it. Technically it belongs to the Hughes family now. Marital assets?" "Thief. I prefer opportunist." Gerardo's thumb stopped moving. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The humor vanished, replaced by a raw, heavy intensity. "I protect what's mine, Sienna. I put my name on you. Even as a lie, that means something to me. You aren't dying in this bunker, and you aren't dying on the streets. I will burn this city down to its bedrock before I let Virgil Woods touch you." Sienna swallowed the lump forming in her throat. She wanted to look away, to break the tension that was pulling the air from her lungs, but she couldn't. She was staring into the abyss, and for the first time, she realized the abyss was holding her up. The heavy silence was shattered by a sharp, high-pitched alarm. Red strobe lights ignited across the ceiling, painting the server room in jagged flashes of crimson. The low hum of the cooling fans was drowned out by a mechanized female voice echoing through the PA system. "Perimeter breach, Sector 4. Blast doors engaged." Gerardo dropped her hand and was on his feet in a fraction of a second. The exhaustion vanished from his face, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating killer. He drew his Glock, checking the sight line toward the heavy steel door of the command room. "Sector 4. Sienna said, her voice shaking as she looked at the security monitors on the wall. "That's the old maintenance tunnels. I thought those were sealed." "They were." Gerardo snarled. He keyed his radio. "Tommy, talk to me." Static hissed back. "Tommy." Gerardo barked louder this time. A different voice answered. It was thick wet with exertion and distorted by the radio frequency. "Your boy is busy bleeding Hughes. Open the blast doors and send out the girl. I'll make it quick for both of you." Gerardo crushed the radio in his hand. Virgil hadn't sent an army. He had sent a surgical strike team through the blind spots. "Get down," Gerardo ordered, grabbing Sienna by the shoulder and shoving her hard beneath the thick steel desk. Part 7, the breach. The world shrank to the space beneath the desk. Sienna curled her knees to her chest, the cold concrete biting through her thin dress. Above her, Gerardo moved with terrifying efficiency. He didn't hide. He dragged the secondary metal table across the floor, flipping it to create a barricade facing the reinforced glass wall of the command room. Gunfire erupted in the outer corridor. It wasn't the chaotic spray of street thugs. It was the measured, rhythmic popping of suppressed rifles. Professional. Lethal. Sparks showered from the electronic keypad outside the command room as a breaching round destroyed the locking mechanism. "Cover your ears and open your mouth!" Gerardo yelled. Sienna obeyed, clamping her hands over her ears and parting her lips to equalize the pressure. A split second later, a concussive blast rocked the room. The reinforced glass wall, rated to withstand small arms fire, bowed inward and shattered under the force of a localized explosive. Millions of glass fragments rained down over the steel desk like deadly hail. Smoke poured into the room, thick and acrid, smelling of sulfur and burnt wiring. Gerardo fired before the smoke even cleared. 2 rapid shots. A heavy body hit the floor outside the shattered frame. Return fire tore through the room. Bullets chewed through the drywall, shattered the computer monitors, and pinged off the steel desk Sienna was hiding beneath. She squeezed her eyes shut, a strangled sob tearing from her throat as a monitor crashed to the floor, inches from her foot. "I need suppressing fire," a voice yelled from the smoke. Gerardo dropped his empty magazine, slammed a fresh one home, and chambered around. "Sienna," he shouted over the ringing in their ears. She opened her eyes. He was crouching beside her, blood dripping from a shallow cut on his cheekbone. He didn't look panicked. He looked furious. He pulled a compact, snub-nosed revolver from his ankle holster and shoved it into her shaking hands. The metal was cold and heavy. 5 rounds. No safety. Gerardo said, his voice hard, cutting through her terror. "If anyone who isn't me comes around this desk, you point it at their chest and pull the trigger until it clicks. Do you understand? I don't know how to shoot!" She gasped, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped the weapon. "You don't need to know how. You just need to want to live." Gerardo gripped her chin, forcing her to look into his eyes. "Do you want to live?" "Yes." "Then hold the damn gun." Gerardo spun away, rising over the edge of the overturned table. He laid down a suppressing barrage, forcing the attackers in the corridor to duck for cover. "Move to the back server rack," Gerardo ordered, grabbing her by the collar of her dress and hauling her out from under the desk. They scrambled across the floor, slipping on the glass and scattered papers. Bullets chased them, tearing chunks of metal off the mainframe cabinets. Sienna threw herself behind the massive humming server rack, her lungs burning, the revolver clutched tightly against her chest. Gerardo slid in next to her. He was out of spare magazines for the Glock. He checked the chamber. 1 round left. "There's an emergency exhaust shaft at the end of this aisle," Gerardo said, his breathing heavy. "It drops down into the active subway lines. We go on 3. "What about Tommy?" Sienna asked, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. "If Tommy is alive, he knows the protocol. He'll meet us at the rendezvous." Gerardo lied. They both knew Tommy was likely dead in the outer corridor. "Ready, Wam?" "No." "Good. 1, 2, 3. Gerardo lunged out from behind the servers. He didn't shoot. He threw his empty Glock with all his strength. The heavy polymer frame struck the nearest attacker square in the face mask, staggering him backward. Gerardo didn't break stride. He closed the distance, grabbing the barrel of the attacker's rifle and forcing it upward as it discharged into the ceiling. He drove his knee into the man's stomach, stripping a combat knife from the attacker's vest and driving it under the edge of his Kevlar in one brutal fluid motion. "Run, Sienna!" Gerardo roared as a second attacker rounded the corner. Sienna didn't freeze. She scrambled down the narrow aisle between the servers, her bare feet cutting on the debris. She saw the heavy metal grate of the exhaust shaft ahead. Behind her, the second attacker leveled his rifle at Gerardo's exposed back. Sienna didn't think. The spreadsheets, the ledgers, the fear, it all evaporated. She stopped, raised the heavy revolver with both hands aimed at the center of the attacker's chest, and pulled the trigger. The recoil was massive, nearly snapping her wrists backward. The gunshot deafened her in the tight space. The bullet caught the attacker in the shoulder, spinning him off balance. His burst of rifle fire chewed harmlessly into the concrete wall. Gerardo used the opening. He finished the man with clinical efficiency, then sprinted toward Sienna. He grabbed the metal grate of the exhaust shaft, his muscles straining as he tore it free from its mountings. "In," he ordered. Sienna crawled into the dark, filthy shaft. It smelled of rat droppings and stagnant water. Gerardo squeezed in right behind her, pulling the heavy grate back into place just as the remaining men breached the server aisle. They slid down the steep metal chute in pitch darkness, the sound of their pursuers echoing faintly above them. They had lost the bunker. They had lost the money's security. But as Sienna clung to the revolver in the suffocating, dark feeling, Gerardo's solid weight right behind her, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't just surviving him anymore. She was fighting for him. Darkness swallowed them whole. The metal chute felt like the throat of a dying beast, slick with decades of grime and condensation. They slid in a deafening rush of scraping fabric and harsh breaths tumbling out into a cavernous, echoing void. Sienna hit the ground hard, her bare feet scraping across uneven gravel. She gasped, the wind knocked completely out of her lungs, and dropped the heavy revolver. It clattered against a rusted steel rail with a sharp, echoing ping. Gerardo landed a second later, his heavy boots absorbing the impact. He didn't pause to check his own injuries. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, high-powered penlight. The narrow beam cut through the suffocating black, illuminating thick concrete pillars and the parallel iron rails of an abandoned subway tunnel. The air down here was dead heavy with the smell of mildew and rusted iron. He swung the light toward Sienna. She was on her hands and knees between the tracks, her shoulders heaving. The adrenaline was finally burning off, leaving nothing but the raw, sickening reality of what had just happened. She had shot a man. She had aimed a gun at a human chest and pulled the trigger. Her stomach violently rebelled. She crawled a few feet away, dry heaving into the gravel, her body shaking so hard her teeth rattled. Gerardo didn't offer empty words of comfort. He stepped up behind her, holstering the penlight in his teeth to keep both hands free. He knelt in the dirt, gathering her heavy, tangled hair and pulling it back from her face. His large, calloused hand rubbed slow, firm circles between her shoulder blades. It was a profoundly intimate gesture in a filthy place. "Breathe through your nose." He instructed, his voice low and steady. He pulled the white handkerchief from his pocket, the same one she had used to stop the bleeding on her knee hours ago, and wiped the cold sweat from her forehead. "I shot him!" She choked out, her voice cracking. She stared at her hands. They were covered in grease dust and tiny cuts from the shattered glass, but all she saw was the recoil. "Gerardo, I shot him." "You stopped him," Gerardo corrected gently, holding her gaze in the dim light. "If you hadn't pulled that trigger, I would be dead on the floor of that server room. You did exactly what you had to do." It felt so loud. She squeezed her eyes shut. It always does the first time. He took her trembling hands in his, pressing his thumbs into her palms to ground her. "But you're breathing. I'm breathing. That's the only math that matters right now. Do you understand?" Sienna nodded slowly, swallowing the metallic taste of bile and fear. She looked up at him. His face was smeared with soot, the shallow cut on his cheekbone sluggishly weeping red into his collar. He looked monstrous, battered, and entirely beautiful. "Can't you walk?" he asked. "I don't have a choice, do I?" A faint ghost of a smile touched his lips. "No, you don't." He stood, pulling her up with him. He retrieved the revolver from the dirt, wiped the grit from the cylinder, and tucked it into his waistband. Taking her hand, he led her down the tracks. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, navigating the subterranean graveyard of the city. Rats scurried away from the beam of the penlight. The distant, muffled rumble of active trains vibrated through the concrete walls miles above them. Eventually the tunnel gradually sloped upward, terminating at a heavy iron grate. Gerardo pushed it open with a groan of rusted hinges. They emerged into the cramped, grease-stained office of an underground auto body shop. The smell of motor oil and stale coffee hit Sienna like a physical wall. An old man in coveralls sat behind a cluttered desk, a double-barreled shotgun resting casually across his lap. He didn't flinch when the grate opened. "Leo," Gerardo said, stepping into the dim fluorescent light. "Boss." Leo replied, his voice like grinding gears. He set the shotgun down and stood, his eyes briefly flickering to Sienna's ruined emerald dress and bleeding feet. He didn't ask questions. Tommy called it in on the secure line 5 minutes ago. He took a graze to the rib cage, but he made it out of the blast zone. He's laying low at the clinic. Gerardo visibly relaxed, the tension bleeding from his shoulders. "And Virgil, bleeding out financially speaking," Leo said, tossing Gerardo a set of keys. His guys realized the payroll accounts were emptied. The mercenaries walked. His lieutenants are raiding his safe houses, trying to grab whatever cash they can carry before they skip town. He's holed up at the estate in the Heights, alone. Gerardo caught the keys. He turned to Sienna. She was standing by a stack of bald tires, looking small and entirely broken. "Sit," Gerardo told her, pointing to a battered leather chair in the corner. He walked over to a first aid kit mounted on the wall, grabbed a bottle of iodine and some gauze, and brought them to her. He knelt at her feet, taking her left ankle. "Gerardo, you don't have to—" "Quiet." He unscrewed the cap and began cleaning the deep scratches on the soles of her feet. He worked with the same meticulous, detached focus he used to clean his weapons. "You stay here with Leo. He's got a cot in the back room and a locked door. Do not leave this garage." Sienna winced as the iodine burned, but she didn't pull away. "Where are you going?" Gerardo taped the gauze in place and looked up. The warmth that had been there in the subway tunnel was gone, replaced by the dead-eyed stare of an executioner. "I'm going to finish my paperwork." Part 9. The annulment. The iron gates of Virgil Woods's estate hung open, swinging lazily in the pre-dawn wind. Gerardo drove the borrowed sedan straight up the circular driveway, crushing expensive landscaping under the tires. He didn't bother cutting the headlights. There was no need for stealth anymore. The front door was ajar. Inside the mansion was a monument to panic. Paintings had been ripped from the walls. Drawers were pulled out and emptied onto the imported Persian rugs. The men Virgil had paid to protect him had picked the carcass clean before fleeing into the night. Gerardo walked through the foyer, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He held his Glock by his side, the safety off. He followed the sound of clinking glass. Virgil was in the study. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk, a crystal decanter of scotch in one hand and a half-empty glass in the other. He looked terrible. His expensive silk shirt was unbuttoned, his face grey and sweating. An assault rifle lay on the desk out of reach. Virgil looked up as Gerardo entered. He didn't reach for the rifle. He just poured another drink. "Hughes." Virgil rasped, his voice hollow. "I figured you'd send one of your boys to do the dirty work." "This isn't dirty work, Virgil," Gerardo said, stopping 10 feet from the desk. He raised the gun, aiming squarely at the center of Virgil's chest. "This is pest control." Virgil laughed, a bitter, broken sound that devolved into a coughing fit. 42 million. The accountant pulled it off. I should have killed her the day I hired her." "You should have stuck to moving drugs. Children aren't cargo." Virgil slammed the glass down on the desk, his eyes flashing with desperate, dying anger. "It's all business, it's all the same. You think you're better than me because you only extort and gamble. We're both monsters, Gerardo. We both belong in the dark." "Maybe," Gerardo said softly. His finger tightened on the trigger. "But I don't sell kids, and I protect my wife." Virgil opened his mouth, perhaps to beg, perhaps to hurl one final insult. Gerardo pulled the trigger twice. The heavy hollow-point rounds hit Virgil square in the sternum, throwing him backward against the leather chair. The decanter shattered, spilling amber liquid across the mahogany wood, mixing with the dark, spreading stain. Gerardo didn't stay to watch him die. He lowered the weapon, turned his back on the corpse, and walked out of the house. The sky outside was beginning to lighten, washing the city in pale, anemic gold. It was over. By the time Gerardo returned to the auto shop, the sun was fully up. The harsh daylight exposed every flaw, every speck of dirt, and every drop of dried blood on his clothes. Leo was asleep in his chair, the shotgun still resting on his lap. Gerardo walked quietly past him, pushing open the door to the back room. Sienna was sitting on the edge of the narrow cot. She had washed her face and changed into a pair of Leo's oversized sweatpants and a grease-stained t-shirt. She looked exhausted, but the frantic terror from the night before was gone. She held a mug of stale coffee between her hands. She looked up as the door creaked. Her eyes scanned him from head to toe, searching for new injuries. Finding none, her shoulders dropped in relief. "Is it done?" she asked softly. Gerardo leaned against the doorframe, suddenly feeling the crushing weight of the last 3 days pressing down on his spine. He nodded. "It's done. The bounty is gone. The network is dismantled. You're free." Sienna stared into her coffee mug. She didn't look happy. She didn't look relieved. She just looked lost. She set the mug down on a nearby crate and stood up, walking slowly toward him. "I stole $42 million, she said, her voice steady. "I shot a man in a subway tunnel. I'm pretty sure my accounting license is going to be revoked." Gerardo let out a short, exhausted breath that might have been a laugh. "You won't need to work another day in your life, Sienna. I'll set up an account for you. Enough money to disappear anywhere in the world. New name, new city, completely safe." She stopped a foot away from him, close enough that he could smell the cheap industrial soap she had used to wash the dirt from her skin. "And the marriage?" she asked, tilting her head. "You promised an annulment." Gerardo's jaw tightened. He looked away, staring at a rusted wrench on a workbench. This was the part he knew was coming. The necessary severance. He was a monster, just like Virgil said. He lived in violence. She didn't belong in this world. Keeping her here was selfish. "I'll have my lawyers draft the papers by tomorrow." Gerardo forced the words out. They tasted like ash. "You'll be legally separated from me. No ties, no liabilities." Sienna reached out. Her fingers, still bruised and scraped, gently touched his jaw, forcing him to look back at her. Her eyes were fiercely bright, cutting straight through his carefully constructed armor. "You're an idiot, Gerardo Hughes," she whispered. Gerardo blinked, entirely caught off guard. "Excuse me, you told me that as long as I wore your name I was untouchable," she said, her thumb tracing the line of his cheekbone. "You told me you protect what's yours." "I do. That's why I'm letting you go. My world is a target, Sienna. I can't guarantee you won't end up in another basement with a gun in your hand." "I didn't ask for a guarantee," she countered, stepping closer, completely erasing the space between them. "I asked for a husband." Gerardo went still. He looked down into her eyes, searching for the fear, for the desperation that had driven her to him in the first place. But all he found was a terrifying, unwavering certainty. She wasn't a hostage to her circumstances anymore. She was choosing this. She was choosing him. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, just as he had done on the dance floor 3 nights ago. Only this time there was no sniper. There was no act. "You're a liability, Miss Mason," Gerardo murmured, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "Then it's a good thing I know how to balance the books," Sienna replied, rising onto her toes. When Gerardo kissed her, it wasn't delicate. It was desperate bruising, and grounded in the dirt and blood of the world they had just survived. It was the absolute end of the annulment, and the terrifying beginning of everything else. The dance had only just begun. Between the shattered glass of the gala and the cold concrete of Gerardo's empire, Sienna had forced a dangerous alliance. But in a world where trust is a liability and betrayal is currency, a fake marriage might just become the most lethal trap of all. Will Sienna survive the wrath of Virgil Woods, or will Gerardo Hughes become a danger she can't escape? If you want to see how this deadly romance unfolds, drop a like, share this story with your fellow drama lovers, and subscribe.